This Cambridge element, titled Aberrant Capitalism, makes the important case that contemporary criticism of capitalism is misplaced. Capitalism is the economic system that has raised global well-being and living standards by thousands of percentage points over hundreds of years. Critics are decrying a capitalism that's an aberration, not the standard. Steve Denning and I build our book on the Ludwig von Mises insight that capitalism is entrepreneurial, not managerial. Entrepreneurship is the economic function that propels living standards upwards by identifying customer needs, meeting them with innovation, and submitting that innovation for market evaluation. We study entrepreneurs like Josiah Wedgwood in 18th century England, who revolutionized dinnerware for customers from royals to rural farm workers. In the 19th century, we examine the invention of the corporation that brought scale and scope to life-improving customer innovations, such as affordable illumination, rail transportation, communications, safe and palatable packaged foods, and productivity devices like sewing machines. These corporations were led by entrepreneurial owners, using their private property, including reinvested profits, to create value-generating capital. The world prospered. What happened? The entrepreneurs exited and the managers entered. At first, they continued the customer value creation purpose of the firm. We cite Procter & Gamble as a good example in the early 20th century. But then entropy set in. Entropy means the diversion of work into non-value creating purposes. First came managerialism as command and control. 2 world wars brought central planning, which spilled over into a government-entangled business management. Bureaucracy became sclerotic and value sapping. Then came financialization, extraction of value for a few managers and their enablers in the financial sector, instead of value creation for customers. The critics of capitalism are really criticizing corporations, their management, and the concentrated anti-customer economic power of the financial sector. But there is hope. The new digital corporations are more customer-centric. We examine their new business models that are driven from the bottom up and the outside in by customer preferences and not managerial planning. We end our study on that optimistic note, but with the caveat that the old and aberrant 20th century management practices that are still taught in business school must be roundly rejected in order for capitalism to be reimagined.
Thank you for joining us today for this important conversation about aberrant capitalism. My name is Heidi Musser. I'll be serving as your moderator today. I'm a retired C-level executive, having worked in 6 different C-level roles in 5 different business models. When I'm not writing or speaking on leadership, women in tech, and reimagining Agile, I serve as a board member and also serve on several advisory boards. Hunter, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Heidi. My name is Hunter Hastings. I'm co-author of Aberrant Capitalism with Steve Denning. I'm an economist, a venture capitalist, and a fan of capitalism.
Thank you. Steve?
I'm a co-author with Hunter, but really the Hunter is the main author of this book. I provided the original idea, but it's Hunter's genius that's delivered an amazing story of what's been going on earlier than the last 50 years.
And Mark?
Yes, good morning. So I'm a business leader and practitioner. I have a background in private equity, and then I've held senior operating executive roles with Fortune 100 companies.
Well, welcome to the panel, and welcome to all who are joining us for this very important conversation. Let's get things started off by this question, and this really goes to Hunter and Steve. Can you tell us why you wrote this book? Why now?
Capitalism is the economic system that has raised the material welfare and the quality of life of billions of people over hundreds of years across the globe to new heights. It's the core of Western civilization and Western values. It's got a problem today, and that is it's losing trust. In a recent Pew Research survey among 18 to 29-year-olds, only 40%, a minority, expressed a positive attitude towards capitalism, and a higher number expressed a positive attitude towards socialism, an alternative system. And so this is a critical moment. We're losing trust in capitalism as an institution, and if we lose capitalism, we'll lose other institutions too. So we really think it's a pivotal moment, and we wanted to contribute to the understanding of why that's happening now.
I mean, my focus was initially on the last 50 years, with a total focus on profits and creating value for shareholders, and to hell with everyone else. And I said, this is not the way things used to be. And of course, most of us, that's all we know. No, that's what we live with. And so we tended to have a very negative attitude to capitalism. So I said, this is aberrant. This particular period is aberrant. Things were better earlier. And Hunter ran with the ball and showed there were amazing things that were happening earlier, very positive developments. And he's laid out in the book what they are. So we need, as we look at the future, which has some bright spots, we can draw on the amazing positive elements that capitalism has had in the past.
Well, the opening quote of the book is, and I quote, "The capitalist system is not a managerial system. It is an entrepreneurial system." Can you elaborate on that? What exactly do you mean by that?
Right. We think entrepreneurship is fundamental to capitalism. So let's explain that. Steve and I went back in history to look at origins, went back to Cantillon and the French tradition. We went back to Smith and the British tradition, the Spanish, the Dutch traditions. It's all about entrepreneurship, and there's no talk of management or managerialism. And what Ludwig von Mises meant in that quote was that entrepreneurship is an externally oriented economic function. It looks to the market, looks to customers, looks to what customers' needs are, and then tries to formulate new value propositions for customers to select. It's entirely customer driven. In fact, Mises said the customer decides what is produced. And he meant that is in the form of customer primacy. Managerialism is more internally oriented. It looks to optimize, to smooth, to make efficient, to control, which we'll talk about more as one of the great problems. And so it blurs that customer vision. And so if we think of management, when we think of capitalism, as Mises said, we're confusing the true role, and the true role is entrepreneurship.
At the same time, managerialism, as you call it, did contribute something. That in the 20th century, we found that when we introduced processes and systems and practices, we could scale organizations much larger and much more rapidly than we could in earlier generations. So there was a huge gain from that, and we became excited about the potential of it. And then maybe we got carried away and said, why don't we make that the whole ball game? And that's when we, I think, got off the rails, and we forgot that the customer was actually central to the whole meaning of the thing. And unless we had that at the center, unless we were innovating and creating new value, these processes would eventually frustrate the customer, would create horrible workplaces, and ultimately not add benefit to society. So in fact, we fell in love with managerialism, and we need to keep loving it, but keep it in its place, not the whole ball game, but a part of the problem.
Yeah, it's definitely a part of the solution. So in the introduction, you outlined the 4 primary criticisms of capitalism. And I think you started to talk about those a little bit already, but Steve and Hunter, which is the most important from your perspective, and why?
Well, what we try to do is analyze those criticisms of capitalism. We group them, as you said, Heidi, under wage inequality, wealth inequality, the environmental damage that capitalism is accused of. There's instability. But the most important is social erosion, we called it, which is this loss of trust in the system. If the whole of society doesn't believe that capitalism is the right vehicle for raising all boats. If we lose that trust, then that's a severe problem. And so if capitalism has brought that criticism on itself, that's its major fault.
And I would say that's the result of focus on profits, total focus on profits, total focus on making money for the company. And so the erosion of trust in organizations flowed from that initial decision. So they're both crucial, but one is the cause, the other is the result, if you like, of and it became politically unacceptable. That in 2019 it was renounced officially, but still lives on underground.
Well, Mark, given your experience as a C-level executive, a CEO, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think there have been some criticisms of capitalism, but it is a system that's evolving, and we've learned a lot of things. Particularly the concentration of wealth and power has been an issue. The exploitation of labor, and we've come a long way since 1920s and 30s, but it's still something that's of concern. The environmental piece, we've made great strides. Now you see regulatory bodies addressing that, so that's a positive change. And there's certainly been market failures, with monopolies and oligopolies, and which can stifle competition. So I think those are some key learnings where we've seen some improvements and some good headway.
Thank you, Mark. Well, Stephen Hunter, one of my favorite references in the book was you talked about the robber barons. I remember studying them when I was working on my first business degree back in the late 70s. Can you tell us about the robber barons? Were they really the bad guys?
Well, that's one of the great symbols of capitalist criticism, which is the identification of 19th century entrepreneurs as robber barons. It was a lady called Ira Tarbell who coined that phrase about Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller. And it's 100% wrong. Rockefeller was in the kerosene industry. Kerosene was a consumer product primarily back then. It brought affordable illumination to homes across America. It extended the time that parents could spend with their families. It extended learning time. It illuminated work in the home, so you could use your Singer sewing machine to make clothes. It was a boon. And Rockefeller at the same time drove down prices so that consumer affordability went up and up. He organized well, he paid well, he ran safe workplaces. And so the robber barons were not robber barons. In fact, the famous historian Paul Johnson said they were really the prospering fathers, the fathers of this kind of capitalism that raises people's living conditions over time. So it's one of those unfortunate phrases that caught on, but it's absolutely the opposite of the truth.
So is it fair to say that the robber barons were actually the good guys?
The robber barons were the good guys. In fact, they're exemplars, as Steve said. They brought scale and scope to this ability to raise the quality of life.
Excellent, excellent. Just a reminder to the audience, we will be entertaining questions, and as they come up, we will take those as appropriate. So please go ahead and ask any questions you have throughout this webinar.
Interesting thing about the robber barons is just the analogy to today's situation, that the trillion-dollar firms we have today have become, in a sense, the robber barons of the current age, and simply by reason of being so successful, that because they are worth so much more and are so wealthy, unbelievably wealthy, that immediately it starts a whole army of critiques. Well, how did this happen? How did they accumulate so much wealth? Is it right? Was there wrongdoing in it? And that happened in a major way with the robber barons of the 19th century. And so we maybe can learn from, and in fact, we got carried away in the 19th century by vilifying and turning them into the robber barons, when in fact they had created huge value for customers and for society in what they did.
So let's fast forward to the post-World War II period, 1945 into the mid-70s. That really is the foundation of many of today's companies. You've noted in the book, Hunter and Steve, that there was a significant shift in the work ethic that was in part brought about by large corporations. That entrepreneurial ethic of folks like Henry Crowell and Richard Sears, it was really replaced by the social ethic of the organization man. I like that term. Can you tell us a little bit more about this period? And isn't this when capitalism as we know it today really became aberrant?
Yes, it's a real pivot point, Heidi. And we precede that part of history with a quick reprise of central planning. There were two world wars, and governments introduced war planning and the war economy. What that meant was they controlled, focused what was produced and the allocation of resources. They controlled prices, they controlled wages. They did very successfully. The production of war materials and uniforms and so on was extremely fast and at a very high level, unprecedented levels. So the central planning then filtered into the private economy after World War II. Literally, some of the executives who were heads of pricing boards and planning boards became C-suite members and CEOs in private sector. And it expressed itself as strategic planning. One of the stories we tell in the book is GE, which was one of the hubs of strategic planning. And there were so many plans and so many layers and so many people in the strategic planning SBU that the CEO himself, Reg Jones at the time, said, "We can't keep up. We've got too many plans. We don't know what to do because we've got too many plans." And so this pivot point was at a time of capitalism where the focus was on fixed capital, big plants. I call them bolted to the center of the earth, steel mills and paper mills and that kind of thing. The focus became the efficient running of those plants. It wasn't adaptive. It wasn't exploratory. You wanted to minimize the cost of labor. You wanted to focus on efficiency. That was the capitalism of the time. And it was profitable, although there's a lot of what they called earnings management. So you're not really sure how profitable it was. But it became sclerotic. That's the time when central planning took over.
We're having quite a lot of questions on robber barons and some questioning, were they really the good guys? Is it simply because creating value for society that turns you into a good guy? Were there some other aspects that we should be looking at? And as we look at the overall situation, do we have things in the right perspective?
Well, so I would defend that enthusiastically. There's an idea we call the entrepreneurial ethic, which is what drives you. And if in entrepreneurship, the market drives you, the customer drives you. So one of the questions asked was, if you're creating value for customers, is that the same as creating value for society? And we would say yes. All of those billions of people that capitalism has raised to new levels of quality of life or material welfare are customers. And so if you have that ethic, you have that drive, then you are making value for society. Heidi mentioned Henry Crowell, who ran what became Quaker Oats. And they introduced packaged food that was much more nutritious than anything that got before. It was safer. The alternative was digging cereal out of a barrel in the general store that might have been infested with vermin. He was creating great value for society, and he was very committed to doing that. And there are lots of stories like that. So yeah, we think the robber barons are the good guys.
But this is part of the dilemma of capitalism, though, isn't it, Hunter? That it's creative destruction, and that it is true that these Standard Oil put a lot of small entrepreneurs out of business, and those people suffered as a result of that, and that was painful, and that is, in a sense, part of the dilemma of capitalism, that it increased per capita incomes enormously in both the 19th and the 20th century. And we tend to now take that for granted and think, well, that's given. We have that, so that's in place. So we didn't need to go through all of the loss to get there. And we start to think, well, we can get more gains without those losses. Is that an issue that we should be addressing more centrally than we have been?
Yes, perhaps. I think what you call creative destruction, or Schumpeter called creative destruction, we can think of as selection. It's the nature of the capitalist market that it selects what is best for customers and for society. And when some get selected, others get deselected. And that's the constant improvement where there is churn, but it's all for the good. And so I think this is attitudinal. We have to recognize that selection and keep companies competing for selection by customers.
Yeah, and along that line, there's another Henry you talk about in the book, and that's related to the Ford story, Henry Ford. Numbers were the key to the system, not people. At some point in time, Ford elevated the knowledge and mastery of systems to an unprecedented level, using the systems and the numbers as a governance tool, really independent of customers, of cars, of the assembly lines in which they were made. How has that affected capitalism?
You had a great word for that, Heidi, and you called it dehumanization of work, and that this tyranny of planning, of numbers, can overtake the creation of value. So that story is David Halberstam told it in The Reckoning. Why did America lose trust in its own automobile industries? And he pointed to Robert McNamara, who was a spreadsheet whiz kid, and he describes how McNamara could describe everything about the numbers of a factory and an assembly line and the cost of tires and so on like that. But if asked what kind of a car would delight customers, he'd be stumped. So this is part of the problem that we're talking about, that the customer can get lost. The humanism, the creativity can get lost in a sea of numbers. And that was part of that post-war pivot that you talk about.
So one of the questions is, when does a good guy become a bad guy? when does someone who's making money, when do they become a bad guy? And Mark, you're the CEO. I mean, have been facing this situation in companies where you have companies that need change in performance, and there are problems, there are issues. How have you dealt with the challenge that you have to make some decisions? You can't just say yes to everyone. You have to make some choices. How have you dealt with that?
Right. So when you look at it, it's a function of the organizational purpose, mission, vision, and driving organizational alignment. And we all have trained resources because we only have so many dollars to work with. So it's a function of establishing priorities, making sure that our decision-making is aligned with our core strategic direction, and then working with your teams to set very clear goals and objectives and work through organizational alignment, which is critical. So it drives towards a clarity of direction, trajectory, and velocity. And I think that's where we've missed a lot of things. So it's, focusing teams and moving in that direction is very powerful, and it becomes a real force multiplier in organizations.
Thank you for that perspective, Mark. Another aspect of this is really, the age of financialization. And, Ford and the numbers, the key to the success. That's from running a business, but there's another aspect of the numbers, and that's the financialization of that. Steve, would you like to comment on that a little bit?
Well, this is financialization is, in my mind, has been the focus on maximizing shareholder value as the be-all and the end-all of organizations, which was launched by Milton Friedman in 1970 and became the gospel of American capitalism until it was supposedly renounced in 2019. It did also emerge on the idea that the very purpose of a firm was to make money, and that the customers vanished from the picture. And if you could make money out of money, that was fine. And you started to see companies that were very good at making money out of money. But it was a very short-term kind of thing, and it didn't lead to long-term value. And so it was a degradation of the basic idea of entrepreneurialism, that you continue to create value for society. And that's one of the questions on the chat is exactly that, about when do you become a bad guy? And one of the things is, if you stop becoming an entrepreneur, you might start out being an entrepreneur, you create value, and at a certain point you close the wagons, circle the wagons, and you protect your monopoly that you've created. And we saw some of that with the robber barons, and we also see some of that today. And it's obviously a political issue on a daily basis that we're discussing. So it is a central issue for society. When does success become a problem?
So I'd like to reinforce that just a little bit, if I may, and that's when the good guys become bad guys, to use the metaphor of the questioner. When they focus on a narrow audience, the financial sector, they're aiming at the financial sector. They're self-dealing. That's what Professor Lazonick accused them of in share buybacks, where many companies use more than 100% of their net income in dividend payments and share buybacks, compared with the robber barons, who drove their companies entirely through reinvested profits. It was all cash flow driven innovation and growth. So I think that is a pivot point. Financialization, as we call it, is the place where capitalism loses trust, because that's when it starts to look like a rigged game.
Mark, in your experience as a senior executive, how did you see this play itself out?
I see two buckets. I think there's some upsides and some downsides in financialization. The upsides are capital mobility, which is critical. And you see some innovations. There's some mitigation of risk with that. There's access to credit, which has been really important for financialization, and some wealth creation. However, the challenge is wealth concentration, which is a big problem. And then some of the negatives are, dominance of financial markets that can lead to financial instability in the systems, which is a problem, and speculative bubbles, which we experienced in the 2008 crisis, and short-termism, which we probably haven't talked a lot about, but is a huge constraining factor on organizations and leaders, because the focus on quarterly results, and it serves the financial folks quite well, but less the customers and less the organization. And I talked about income inequality. So those are some perspectives on both the upsides and downsides of financialization.
Yeah, it seems like somewhere along this journey we've moved a little bit away from the purpose of the organization, the value, the customer. And one of my favorite Peter Drucker quotes is, the purpose of an organization to enable ordinary human beings to do extraordinary things. The purpose of the organization isn't financialization, or isn't process optimization. It isn't those things. It's creating value. It's the people side for customers and certainly people themselves. So as we talk about this, what are some of the other diversions from customer value creation? You talk about these in the book a little bit, Hunter and Steve. What are some of these other diversions?
Well, one of the areas that we track through the 20th century is the growth of bureaucracy in corporations to manage the scale and scope, but go beyond to greater levels of control of various kinds. And bureaucracy doesn't have a customer focus typically. It doesn't have a P&L orientation. That's not its purpose. Its purpose is rules, and to make the growth of the corporation more predictable, more smooth, to do things like DEI and ESG. Those generate big bureaucracies. And there was a famous Harvard Business Review survey that we quote in the book about what people who work in corporations, the executive in corporations say the problems of bureaucracy. And there are things like, a waste of time. Time is not devoted to the customer, it's devoted to internal functions. The conservatism of investing in new innovation, and just general bureaucratic waste and jobs which are not oriented towards the customer. So I think the growth of bureaucracy has been one of the elements of the corporation that we need to take a new look at.
Mm-hmm. Steve?
And I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is that these entrepreneurs succeed and gain great wealth, they have access to money, they have access to power, they have access to political players. And if we don't watch out, they can be using those special kinds of access to simply build moats around their business, even a monopoly business, and prevent opposition work. And to deal with that, we need to have appropriate regulation on the government side. And of course, we have active efforts in both Europe and the US to regulate. And there are ongoing discussions about whether the regulation is focused on the issues, whether it's focused on success as a problem in itself and wanting to scale back organizations which have been successful and accusing them of being monopolies, when it's often hard to see how they're monopolies when we see the ferocity of the competition between the organizations. So there are difficult issues of getting the right balance, and we continue to struggle with that, and we'll do so for some time, particularly as the situation is extremely dynamic, and that some companies, maybe a small proportion, 20%, are growing extremely rapidly, and the other 80% are growing much more slowly. And so the gaps are growing, and the challenges between those two different populations is, and lessen until the 80% of sense find out why the 20% evolving rapidly. What are they doing that is creating value, that is generating the wealth that they are enjoying and the growth that they're enjoying? And that's one of the positive notes that the book turns to at the end, that there is in fact a new birth of entrepreneurialism, and sharing those insights is really part of the new agenda for the future of capitalism, so that everyone, all organizations, whether they're large trillion-dollar firms or medium-sized or even tiny organizations, they need to be learning about what's involved. And so that's one of the goals of the Lisbon conference, is actually to share the insights of these lessons, that what is it that is enabling some companies to grow, and how can those lessons be shared with others so they can also grow and share the benefits to the whole of society and what they do.
Mark, do you have anything to add to this from the CEO perspective?
Yeah, I would say my response would be, so how do we work to reverse this as we consider this, and how do you do that? So as CEOs and leaders in businesses, we operate in a very challenging environment: regulatory, technological, social, environmental factors, all of these with a focus on creating long-term value creation, and it's quite balancing to do that. I point to leadership, and from a leadership perspective, and I look at the world from what we call a post-heroic manager era, and maybe what we call leadership 2.0. And heroic managers in the past, that we knew coming out of the 50s and 60s, knew it all, did it all, solved every problem. But the post-heroic managers are quite different, what we're experiencing. These are leaders today who ask how every problem can be solved in a way that develops other people's capacity to handle it. So it really goes back to the people side. Clayton Christensen from Harvard and Bill George have been speaking about humble and yet confident leaders. and vulnerable leaders. So we're seeing this tone change in leadership in organizations as to how we're going to move forward. So I think that's been really important. And we're entering this new age of what we call the conceptual age, or more right brain competencies that will help drive design thinking and empathy, and that are crucial. And also an era of creative leadership, where we're fostering innovation, which is going to be central to what we're doing. Creative leadership emphasizes, the development of social and human capital, leading to enhanced innovation and agility and organizational success. And then we're seeing these really great examples of highly interconnected nodes of innovation in organizations where they have the power and they have the capabilities and they have the financial wherewithal to be able to be very close to customers and solve problems real time and develop solutions real time. So we're seeing some great movement in these areas that help, move beyond bureaucracy and get the agility and flexibility more intrapreneurship in organizations.
We have a great question on, can we disconnect the issue of bureaucracy from size, which is a question I love, because one of the most bureaucratic organizations I ever worked in was an organization that had about 10 people. And those 10 people were the most bureaucratic people I ever met. Process built on process, and we simply couldn't get anything done and eventually had to leave. So, but bureaucracy is a huge problem. I'd be interested in Hunter and Mark view on how do we deal with it? It's almost like a disease that processes grow on processes. Do you see any chance that we can make progress in this issue or any kind of organization?
Yeah, I think we can, and some of it is delayering organizations. It's very easy to add layers, but no one goes back and say, well, why do we have these positions? And why do we have these layers? And let's go back and ask that question. And I think when you do that, and then you work with organizational empowerment, engagement, and enlightenment, you could do some flattening of organizations and get people to think in different ways and collaborate in different ways.
In fact, Steve, we have the source of the solution, which is the network as opposed to the hierarchy. We like to understand networks. They are primarily delayered, as Mark calls it. And we're also beginning to understand complex adaptive systems, which are also not hierarchies, and they're not driven by processes. So the source of the change is with us. We need to do a lot more work in exploration and discovery to understand that. But in the modern age, those are the two tools that we have.
Yeah, there's a number of questions here from the audience. And before we explore other things that must be done, I'd like to speak to some of this. We talked a little bit about bureaucracy. What about the relationship? I see a few questions about the relationship with capitalism to government in the regulatory environment. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing?
Well, I'll dive in first there, Heidi. We talk in the book about entanglement, which is where government and the private sector become entangled. It didn't happen with the robber barons, the good guys, because government wasn't big enough to get involved and they didn't need it. But as we went through the 20th century with this war planning and bureaucracy and regulation and so on, the entanglement grew up, and there became a benefit for corporations to design legislation, to seek tariffs, and to seek protection. And on the other hand, there's government subsidies into the private sector for various industries and the moonshots that they sometimes undertake. So there is an entanglement, and I think today we're talking about a government ban on TikTok, which is a terrible piece of entanglement. So I think that's a place we have to examine and see what we can unentangle. It's a problem.
Yeah, and I think there's an opportunity in business and industry within professional organizations to consider self-regulation before you have to be regulated by government. And it's been my experience in working with ecosystems that if you say, what do we do that makes all of us become better actors? and you create these agreements on not necessarily processing systems, but how we'll operate, how we as an industry can do things better. It's typically a better solution than creating burden from a federal or state government point of view.
We have an interesting question from Kurt Carlson, former CEO. How do you reverse some of these problems, and how do you elevate value creation? Interested in Mark Hunter. What's your take, particularly the advent of AI? Will AI help solve these problems or create even more bureaucracy?
Well, I'm an optimist on AI because it's an augmentation of human creativity and human capacity, as Heidi and Mark have talked about. I think reversal, Kurt has nailed it. When you look at Amazon, one of the companies we admire, they talk about working backwards from the customer. And that's a reversal of the typical business model, which is a flow out to the customer. That's how we think. We produce, we distribute, we market, we merchandise, and eventually we get to the customer. Reversing the flow, what does the customer need in the world of AI and all the other technical advances in current society? This reversal, another way I like to say it is the customer is the business model. Can we change the business model so it flows in this opposite direction? Value flows from the market to the firm, and they recognize that. So I think, using Kurt's word, this concept of reversal is very powerful.
Thank you for that, Hunter. Yeah, thank you very much. And now, really, this is a time for hope. I really love the title of Chapter 8 in your book, Reimagination. Faced with some of these realities that we've been talking about, financialization, bureaucratization, failure of management theorizing, the destructive entanglement of corporations with government, the uselessness of the prevailing economics and the distorted purpose of the corporation. How can capitalism move forward? So, to each of you, if there's one single focus, what should it be? What's next? What should it be? And I'm going to start with you first, Steve. What's the one thing?
In one sentence, we need to put mindsets ahead of processes. Mindsets must be driving the processes. Unless we have a value creation mindset, it doesn't matter what process you institute, no matter how clever the process is, it will be subverted if it's driven by a process of, driven by a mindset that is the opposite, a mindset of making money for the company. The process will inevitably become a problem. So having value creation mindsets driving everything in the organization is the most important thing, part of this, the new world, the new paradigm, I would call it, of management in the world today.
Mark, what would you say? What would be that one single focus?
Yeah, stakeholders. We need to move way beyond shareholder supremacy and think stakeholders and get the organization to move in that direction.
Very good, very good. And while we're focusing on these things and moving capitalism forward, Hunter, back to you for a moment. What would be the one thing you would have us focus on?
Well, I've lost my background. I'm sorry, but I'm still here. It's clarity of purpose. And Steve has mentioned this before. It's consistent with what Mark and Steve just said. The clarity of the purpose is an obsession with creating some kind of differentiated, superior, advancing value for customers. And if we can get that clarity, our point is that it's being confused by all the things we talked about, bureaucracy, financialization, planning, and so on. That will be the step that will lead to all the other improvements that we're seeking.
Thank you for that, Hunter. So what shall we continue doing while we attempt to fix what is broken? So we're not going to start the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. So what shall we continue doing? What's the key takeaway from this conversation? And this time, I'm going to start with you, Mark.
I would say explore, exploit. To have that adventurous spirit and courageous leaders that in their business and in their marketplace saying, what are we doing to explore and exploit and innovate is going to be critical. And those will be the organizations that are sustainable.
Steve?
I would like to cite my old master, Peter Drucker, and say that we should look out the window and see what's out there and not yet seen. And I think if we do that, we will see an amazing array of exciting, positive things happening in the world. And I've talked about some of them. The conversation or the question, and one of the questions is, this all sounds very American, and there've only been one or two companies mentioned, and they have been American, but there are a slew of European companies that I've written about and will be writing about more. LVMH, an amazing company that has grown extraordinarily in a very entrepreneurial fashion. You wouldn't think you could make money out of clothing the way that they are doing it. Novo Nordisk, an amazing Danish company that is also showing the way in Europe. So Europe can do this. It hasn't been as much of the sort of the psyche of Europe to they somehow lost the entrepreneurial sense that was very striking 100, 200 years ago, but it's still there and it's vibrant, and we're highlighting it, and we'll be highlighting it in the Lisbon conference. This will not be an American conference. It will be a global conference. That's the World Management Agility Forum, and it will be looking at American companies, yes, but also European and Asian and Australian companies. This is looking at the global perspective.
And Hunter?
Well, my one thing is innovate with empathy. So I think the great strength of capitalism lies in its innovation and its responsiveness to customer needs and finding better and better ways to do that. And we still achieve that. What's missing is the empathy that is the result of, or the consequence of missing empathy is that we've lost that trust. I noticed Chris Valley in the comments called it knowing the things that matter. If you can understand your customer well enough and know what matters to them, and then respond to what matters to them to make them feel better, that's what I call innovation with empathy. So I think we do innovation well. I think we do empathy a little bit better.
Fantastic, fantastic. I want to thank you, Hunter and Steve, co-authors of the book Aberrant Capitalism, and Mark. Thank you for joining us and providing the very important perspective of from the CEO seat, if you will. What a provocative, stimulating, and delightful conversation we've had here today. To all of our attendees, first, thank you for your questions and following the commentary in the chat a little bit. And as long as we keep asking questions, I believe there's hope. I really do believe that. So to all of our attendees, you'll find in your email all of the information about this webinar, the link to purchase the book, the promotion code to purchase tickets for the World Management Agility Forum in the fall, as well as the link to see our webinar again on YouTube. Okay, so you can get more information, and I think we're going to show this information for you here in the World Agility Forum.org website. Okay, so most importantly, sign up now for the next webinar in our series on reimagining Agile, and that's going to be coming up with this wonderful group of colleagues, Jim Highsmith, Chet Hendrickson, Angie Doyle, and Rashina Hoda, and that's going to be on April 18th. You can see the times on your screen: Lisbon, New York, Los Angeles. And finally, please join us at the 2024 World Management Agility Forum in Lisbon on September 19th through the 21st. Our mission is to inspire a global shift in management thinking one person at a time. We'll get there. Thank you.